Continuing with some of the definitions that you'll hear me toss around as if everybody already knows them, so hey, let's go ahead and define them. Let's define some definitions. These are ones that are specific to paint and therefore aren't necessarily going to show up in broader color theory conversations, but you'll hear me use them a lot when I'm talking to you about mixtures of color and things like that. So, one thing that we want to know about is the mass tone, or what's sometimes also referred to as the body color of a paint. When you squirt something out of a tube, what color is it when it's just sitting there? This is different than the undertone. The undertone is basically how does it want to dress up for Halloween? So yes, cadmium red deep is a red. Its mass tone, its body color is a straight but dark red. But you can see that it has an undertone, a sort of hint of purple compared to the undertone of cadmium red light, which is more orangey. So the undertone is the which way does that color lean. If I'm thinking about the colors that are in our kit, we have deliberately some repetition in hue categories. You have more than one tube of red, but that's because we're going to have a warm red and a cool red, or in the yellows, we'll have a warm yellow or a lower intensity or a cooler yellow. And so we've got variation in there because of the subtractive color mixing thing that we've talked about before. Tinting strength is how strong is that paint in mixture. So, for example, if you look at the mass tone of naphthol red and the mass tone of cadmium red medium, you can see that they're actually pretty similar. Both of them are relatively straightforward red. And naphthol is way cheaper and less poisonous, but cadmium is in our kit because of how they act with the tinting strength. So up here, you're seeing the tint, which is essentially this color plus 50% white. And you can see that the difference between the kind of pink that you get when you add 50% white for cadmium red is much softer in tinting strength than the really strong kind of hot pink that you get with a naphthol red. So even though the mass tones are fairly similar, the tinting strength is quite different. And because among other projects, we're going to be doing a grid-based self-portrait, which is essentially mixing skin tones. We want to have the cadmium because it's going to react more appropriately in our mixture. Also, it has better light fastness, which we'll talk about in just a second. If we were trying to mix skin tone with the naphthol, everyone would look like a Muppet, which would be a lot of fun, but not necessarily good for color theory. So what was that light fast thing? Light fastness is the quality whereby we rate how likely a pigment is to fade. Now, sometimes we do that by comparing different pigments. You can see that this pigment is fading more than this pigment. And so sometimes we're going to choose pigments like cadmium that don't fade as much as other pigments. Pigments that we know that will fade, we call fugitive. Sometimes they still make art supplies out of pigments that we call fugitive because people like them, and in certain applications, maybe it's okay. If, for instance, you're painting a Lamborghini, you don't need that color to be super light fast because the dude bro who's going to buy a Lamborghini is going to wrap it around a telephone pole way before the color starts to fade. So some colors are light fast, some colors are fugitive. We're also seeing here a differentiation between what's called artist grade paint and student grade paint. We can see that if we look at the top. Up here, they're using the same pigment in every single one of these samples. And I should say what they're doing with these samples is painting a big swatch, covering up half of it, putting it in a machine that will expose it to like a decade's worth of UV light in, say, an hour. So it's basically Donald Trump's tanning bed. And they nuke the color, and then the part that is exposed is going to fade at least a little bit. And even with high quality paints, you can see that there is a little bit of a difference. But here, the difference is not so much the pigment. All of these are the same pigment. It's basically the quality of the paint. And the ones that are the higher artist grade or professional grade are going to fade a lot less than the ones that are called student grade or basics or things like that. And the reason basically comes down to the fact that there is a higher pigment load. There is more fancy color stuff in this paint than there is in this paint. So even when it comes out of the tube looking pretty much the same, this undiluted part looks pretty similar to some of the ones over at this end. But if we expose it to a lot of UV, it's going to fade pretty fast. So that's one of the reasons why certain pigments cost more. The other thing that we're seeing on this chart is that certain pigments are transparent and certain pigments are opaque. We're actually going to switch to this so that you can see it. And it's basically how to read a tube of paint. If you were to go to the store and see golden acrylic, we'll do this thing where they have these printed black bars on the tube of paint, and then they smear some of the actual color as opposed to it just being a printed label so that you can see how transparent or opaque it is. If it completely covers up the bars, it's going to be an opaque solid paint. If even when they haven't watered it down, you still see the black bars, that means that you are seeing that it is a transparent color. This is important for you to know because certain mixtures are going to be easier to achieve depending on whether or not you're trying to get an opaque color or a transparent color. For instance, on the grid-based self-portrait that we're going to work on in a little while, those of you who have dark hair are going to find that the browns that are in our kit are a little transparent. They're semi-transparent, which means that you have to work a little harder or put down multiple coats to cover the canvas without the canvas showing through. So knowing whether or not your paint is transparent is a useful thing. Here they're also showing you a couple of other things. A lot of times the name of the paint is less important than what the pigments are. And so you want to look for paint that is going to tell you what the pigment is. Often they'll give you the chemical names: phthalo green yellow shade, Hansa yellow light, nickel azo yellow. Those are all the pigments from which these are derived. Sometimes they'll only give you the abbreviation. So PY150 stands for a pigment yellow 150, and you could, in theory, go and look it up and see what it is. Part of why you care about this, in addition to the fact that you can just be a big science nerd, woohoo, is a lot of times the name of the paint, which is just a descriptor created by the manufacturer, will disguise the fact that they are putting together pigments that you already have. So for instance, if you were to go and buy Winsor Blue, it's already got a pigment in it that you might own previous to this, and you wouldn't need to bother with it, because if all they're doing is adding white and blue, you could do that on your own. Why spend $8 on a tube of paint? So while we're also looking at how to read a tube of paint, you can see the light fastness rating there. A lot of times it'll be done as Roman numerals. Sometimes it'll be stars. Every now and then it'll be A, B, C, D. But generally speaking, you want to get paint that is as light fast as possible. The price group label here is talking about how expensive that pigment is. That is different than what we were talking about when we were talking about if we're talking artist grade or student grade. The entire line of an artist grade paint is going to cost more, but some pigments, say burnt umber, which is basically they dig up a rock in Italy and they cook it, is cheaper than something that is really poisonous or hard to work with, which is why you want to be aware of and look out for the big giant orange and black X symbol. ASTM, American Standards of Testing of Materials, does a health and safety notification. And you're going to find that some of the tubes of paint in our kit are going to be labeled as toxic. This product contains cadmium, a chemical known to the state of California to cause cancer or to cause birth defects or whatever else it is. Some of the pigments that we use are what are known as cumulative carcinogens, which means that if it gets inside your body can't break it down, it'll build up, eventually you'll get cancer. The good news is that you can prevent this by not putting it in your body. Don't eat the paint. Also, if you're worried about health and safety, wearing gloves will keep your skin from absorbing any of the pigments. And then the one that you really do want to pay attention to, and that's what this label is telling you, is that it can cause cancer by inhalation. In other words, you can breathe it in. If, say, you sand down an old canvas, you could breathe in the little particles of pigment. Because we're using acrylic paint, the solvent is water, so you don't have to worry about fumes or breathing in chemicals unless you're sanding. So either don't sand or wear a big giant respirator when you're sanding. And we mean like a real respirator, not that stupid little white thing that you've seen at the hardware store, but the kind that makes you sound like Darth Vader when you're breathing. That's the kind of respirator you would need. Or let me know if, for instance, you're potentially going to be pregnant over the course of this semester. Let me know and I can give you some substitutes of less toxic pigments. We have several pigments in our kit that are toxic because normal handling of them will still be fine. They're the cadmiums and the cobalt are the ones that you want to keep an eye on. But as long as you're not sanding or, say, smoking cigarettes while you're finger painting or eating a lasagna while you're scooping up both paint and your food at the same time, generally speaking, you should be fine. You can actually work with this paint at home. That's part of why we use acrylic paint. You don't need special solvents. It's cleaned up with water.